Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. The rain came softly first, a delicate patter against the ivy-clad windows of Hazelworth Grange, that genteel country house which sat in repose beneath the Sussex hills. By twilight, it had become a steady, melancholic drumming, the kind that seemed to draw secrets out of walls and whisper them through keyholes. Inside, the drawing-room glowed with the gentle flicker of firelight. Silver candlesticks trembled in the draughts. The scent of wax mingled faintly with bergamot tea and lilac perfume. Conversation drifted above the crackle of the hearth. Laughter, polite and brittle, masking unease. It was Thursday, the 12th of October, 1938, the night of Lady Hesketh's little gathering. No grand affair, merely a supper of select guests and a promise of music after. Yet there was something strained in the air, a tension as perceptible as the crack of static before a storm. Lady Hesketh, plump and bejewelled, surveyed her guests with the indulgent pride of a hostess convinced that all was well. At her elbow sat the Reverend Pottle, murmuring about moral decline. Near the window stood Colonel Fawkes, his moustache bristling with military impatience. But it was Mrs. Amelia Linton, the pale widow in dove-grey silk, who drew the eyes of the room, not through beauty, but through silence. She sat apart, hands folded on her lap, gaze fixed on the teapot before her, as though it held some dreadful fascination. "More tea, Mrs. Linton?" inquired Lady Hesketh, lifting the silver pot with the air of a benevolent monarch. The widow smiled faintly. "Thank you. Just a little. No sugar," the Reverend chuckled. "Austerity in all things, eh?" Mrs. Linton said nothing. The delicate china cup trembled as she took it, steam rising like a ghost between them. Outside, thunder murmured beyond the downs. A candle guttered. The grandfather clock marked the hour. 9. By 9:30, Mrs. Linton was dead. The scream came from the parlour-maid, a shrill, unearthly sound that turned every head. In a moment the guests were on their feet, chairs overturned, the fine china shattered against the rug. "Good Lord!" cried the Colonel. "Fetch a doctor!" But it was no use. Mrs. Linton's face was already paling, lips blued, eyes fixed in a glassy stare of incomprehension. Her teacup lay overturned beside her hand, the faint scent of almonds rising above the bergamot. Almonds, that ancient, unmistakable odour of poison. Later the servants whispered that she had clutched her throat, gasping, that her last words had been something unintelligible, a name perhaps, or a plea. Lady Hesketh fainted. The Colonel bellowed for the police, and through it all, the rain went on falling, soft and relentless, upon the roof of Hazelworth Grange. Far away in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple was trimming the wick of her bedside candle when she heard the bell from the lane. A young constable stood at her gate, drenched and breathless, hat in hand. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple. There's been a death at Hazelworth Grange. Lady Hesketh says you're the one to fetch." Miss Marple looked up from her sewing with mild surprise. "Dear me," she murmured. "Hazelworth, you say? Well then, I suppose the kettle must wait." She rose, wrapped her shawl, and stepped out into the rain. The candle flickered as the door closed behind her, leaving the room in stillness, and somewhere, in the echoing corridors of the Grange, a secret waited, quiet, deadly, and steeped in tea. Chapter. The carriage lamps cut through the mist like weary eyes as Miss Marple arrived at Hazelworth Grange. The great iron gates creaked open, revealing a drive slick with rain and shadow. Even before she stepped inside, she could sense that the house, for all its wealth and polish, was uneasy. Grief does not always manifest in tears. Sometimes it hides in the too silent corridors, in the absence of voices where laughter should be. A constable met her at the door. Young, freckled, earnest. "Inspector Graves is within, ma'am." "They've moved the lady to the morning room," Miss Marple nodded. "How very proper."
"Lead on, if you please." Inside, the air was close and thick with the mingled scents of wax, damp wool, and, faintly still, bitter almonds.
The corpse of Mrs. Amelia Linton lay on a sofa beneath a shawl, her expression unnervingly calm. Her lips were tinged faintly blue. Her right hand curled loosely, as if clutching at something unseen. Inspector Graves, a square-shouldered man with a face like carved sandstone, turned as Miss Marple entered.
"Evening, Miss Marple."
"Lady Hesketh swore by you. Says you've got a knack for these things," she smiled faintly. "Oh, dear Lady Hesketh is far too kind. But I do have eyes." "And a little memory." Graves grunted, taking notes in a worn leather book. "Name's Amelia Linton. Widow of a banker, came down to Sussex last month. Dined here tonight. Complained of a headache, took tea and collapsed. Doctor says poison. Prussic acid." Miss Marple's brows rose.
"So swift and certain a death."
"Then the poison must have been concentrated indeed. The tea, you say?" "Aye. She was the only one to drink from that particular cup."
"Silver pot's clean. Sugar untouched." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple softly. "And yet she asked for no sugar." The inspector frowned.
"What of it? Only that one who never takes sugar might not notice if another did." Graves blinked. "You mean someone tampered with it?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "That depends. Tell me, who poured the tea?"
"Lady Hesketh herself." "Indeed?"
"Then it was an act of hospitality, and perhaps of murder." The words seemed to hang in the candlelight like smoke. They moved to the drawing-room, where the surviving guests huddled in uneasy silence. The fire had burned low, leaving more shadow than warmth. Lady Hesketh sat rigid in her armchair, her jewels trembling faintly as she clutched a handkerchief.
"Oh, Miss Marple, it was dreadful, simply dreadful."
"Poor Amelia, I poured her tea myself."
"And now to think—"
She dabbed at her eyes. Colonel Fawkes paced the carpet.
"Dash business, that's what it is. Poison under one's very nose. I say, Graves, can't your men see to it swiftly?"
"We're not to be detained all night like common suspects, are we?" The inspector's tone was dry. "Depends, Colonel, whether you are common suspects." A delicate cough came from the piano stool, where Miss Lydia Crane, Lady Hesketh's young niece, sat pale and trembling.
I can't think who would do such a thing. Mrs. Linton seems so gentle." Miss Marple studied her quietly.
"Gentle souls sometimes provoke unkindness, my dear. Did she seem troubled this evening?" Lydia hesitated. "Only—" When the post arrived, there was a letter. She went quite still after reading it. Graves turned. "A letter, you say? Where is it now?" Lydia gestured toward the mantelpiece, where a single folded paper lay beside the clock. Graves took it up carefully and frowned. "It's empty." A silence followed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed.
"Empty or emptied? Someone has removed the contents." "How careless of fate to leave only the shell," the colonel growled.
"Blast it all, Graves. Are we to suspect everyone here?" We all drank the same tea. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not quite, Colonel. Mrs. Linton's cup was poured last, was it not?" Lady Hesketh's eyes widened. "Why, yes, I believe it was." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "someone was waiting for precisely that." The hours crept on. The guests were questioned, the servants lined up in trembling rows. Each swore ignorance, the butler, the maid, the footman. Yet beneath the formality, Miss Marple felt it, a current of deceit, faint but unmistakable. She wandered into the dining room, where the remains of supper still lingered. Candles guttered, napkins stained with wine, a faint scent of roasted pheasant. Her eyes alighted upon the tea tray. 6 cups, 1 overturned, a small silver pot of cream, a bowl of sugar lumps untouched. She lifted the sugar tongs delicately. A fine powder clung to one edge. Interesting, she thought. Sugar that no one tasted, and yet someone touched. She turned as the door creaked. Lydia Crane stood there, pale as the wax candles. "Oh, Miss Marple, they say the police will search my room."
"I swear I've nothing to hide."
"My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "those who are innocent need not fear a search. But tell me, you seemed frightened when the letter was mentioned. Was it addressed to you, perhaps?" Lydia shook her head.
"No, but I saw the handwriting."
"It was Mr. Linton's." Miss Marple's gaze softened.
"Her late husband's?"
"Yes," whispered Lydia. "But he's been dead these 3 years." The clock struck midnight. Somewhere beyond the misted windows, an owl called once, long and mournful. Miss Marple looked back toward the hearth, where the dying fire threw its last embers. "Dead 3 years," she murmured. "And yet he writes."
"How curious indeed," the inspector rejoined her at the door.
"We'll send for a handwriting man in the morning. For now, we'll seal the rooms and post a guard." Miss Marple nodded, eyes on the rain-dark glass. "Yes, Inspector. But I fancy the truth may not wait for daylight." Graves frowned. "Meaning what?" "Meaning," she said softly, "that one of your guests is already making plans to remove what should not be found." And as she spoke, a shadow moved across the landing above, silent, deliberate, and a faint click echoed as a door was locked from within. Chapter. Morning broke with a gauzy, indifferent light. The rain had abated, leaving droplets like tremulous pearls along the window panes of Hazelworth Grange. A hush hung over the house, not serenity, but the heavy quiet of a place where everyone listens to the sound of his own heartbeat and wonders if someone
"Else can hear it too, Inspector."
Graves had set his men to work at first light, knocking softly along skirting boards, peering at ash in the fireplaces, questioning servants with the patience of a ploughman turning earth. Miss Marple, who had been given a small guest chamber at the back of the house, came down soon after 7, her shawl fastened neatly, her expression mild and interested. She had that pleasant air of being in nobody's way and yet missing nothing. "Good morning."
"Inspector," she said, stepping into the morning room,
where the body had been removed and the furniture set in the dignified disorder of aftermath. "May I be of some little use?" Graves, bleary-eyed and grateful, gestured toward the dining room. "If you'll sit in with me for the interviews, I'd be obliged." The doctors confirmed it. Hydrocyanic acid.
"Instant, near enough."
"We've sealed the tea things." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is usually very sudden and very simple, at least in the mind of the murderer." They went in together. The dining room had been cleared, though the tables still bore a ghost of last night. A faint crescent of wine on the linen, a sugared crumb near a plate, a solitary candlestick like a watchman on duty. On a side table, beneath a glass bell, lay the tea tray, 6 cups and saucers, the silver pot, the cream jug, and the untouched bowl of sugar lumps with its delicate tongs. Powder had been brushed from the tong tips into a folded evidence paper. The faint scent of bergamot lingered like a whisper. One is not quite sure one heard. Graves began with the servants. "Mr. Chivers," he said, as the butler materialized in the doorway, "we'll start with you. Mr. Chivers, a man of severe profile and evenly ironed sorrow, took his place. He stood rather than sat, as if the power to fold at the knee had been removed from his manufacture. "You supervise the tea service, I take it?" asked Graves. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Brabazon brewed, as is proper, in the kitchen."
"I oversaw the steeping time."
"The pot was rinsed with hot water first. The leaf was Earl Grey quality blend. I poured the tea into the silver pot and placed it on the tray with the cups, cream, and sugar. The parlour-maid carried it to the drawing-room, the parlour-maid being—"
"Elsie, sir." "And who touched the tray after it left the kitchen?" "Elsie, sir."
"Then her ladyship, who poured—" Miss Marple's eyes strayed to the polished spoon bowl of the cream jug. No lemon served? Chivers permitted himself a controlled dismay. Lemon with a perfumed grey, madam, would be unusual? Quite so. Graves flipped a page in his book. Did you notice anyone lingering in the dining room or kitchen as the tea was set up? Chivers closed his eyes briefly, recalling with the cool camera of a professional memory. Miss Crane came to the door to ask if there were more macaroons.
I said there were.
She took 2 for the Reverend. Colonel Fawkes passed through on his way from the lavatory, the downstairs lavatory, that is, and grumbled about the draught. The cook and I were present at all times. Miss Marple's voice was gentle.
And Mrs. Linton, did she go near the tray?
No, madam. She remained in the drawing room. Graves dismissed him and called Elsie, the parlour-maid, a thin girl with anxious hands and a heart that seemed determined to leap out of her pinafore. I carried the tray in. Sir, she said, twisting a corner of her apron. Set it on the low table by the fire. Her ladyship poured for everyone. I was sent for the good spoons, the ones with the little roses. When I came back, she swallowed.
It had happened, Mrs. Linton, She
let out a gasp, like she couldn't get air, and then she slid off the chair. I dropped the spoons and screamed. I'm sorry, sir. I couldn't help it. Before you came back, how long were you gone? Minute or 2. Mr. Chivers keeps the good spoons in the sideboard. The one in the passage by the green baize door, Miss Marple asked. And when you returned, did you notice the cups? Were they all where they had been?
Elsie frowned. I don't rightly know, madam. There was such a to-do.
But I think Mrs. Linton's saucer had been moved nearer the hearth. The carpet there is thicker. Graves made a note. Who stood nearest the tray while you were gone?
I can't say, sir. Perhaps the Colonel.
He was by the mantel, complaining the fire smoked.
And the Reverend. He'd gone to the piano to see if it were in tune. Thank you, Elsie. That'll do.
Mrs. Brabazon, the cook, followed, a stout and offended presence with arms folded over a bastion of calico.
I won't hear it said, she declared, before being asked, that there was anything unclean in my kitchen, Inspector.
I keep things as the Lord likes his altars, bright, hot, and orderly. The tea was fine. I'd taste it myself. Graves was accustomed to cooks who considered police inquiry a personal insult. He kept his voice mild. We've no reason to doubt your housekeeping, ma'am. Only tell us who had access to the tea leaves and the pot. The leaves is kept in the red tin in the pantry, high shelf. Mr. Chivers holds the key. The silver pot never leaves this house except to be polished in the scullery. She softened a little toward Miss Marple. If there's been wickedness, it weren't in the boiling nor the steeping. You may depend upon that. Miss Marple nodded.
And the sugar, Mrs. Brabazon? Where is it kept?
Lumps in the blue tin by the window. But the little bowl you see there were filled fresh last evening by Elsie. I saw her do it. Miss Marple's eyes moved again to the bell jar and the innocent geometries of white cubes. In that cold light, they looked like small blocks of marble in a mausoleum. There followed the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalloway, who attested to the locking of doors at night, the footman, Peter, who had seen the Colonel remove a case of cigars from the hall table, and the gardener who, though irrelevant,
had been summoned and made unhappy by it, at last.
The guests. Colonel Fawkes planted his broad hands on the table and growled, I shall not be detained much longer, Graves.
There's no sense in it.
We all drank the same dratted tea. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Forgive me, Colonel, but did you? I had an impression of your whisky glass making an appearance. He coloured slightly beneath the whiskers. Well, perhaps I did take a nip to fortify myself. Weather plays the deuce with one's joints. Then you did not drink the tea. I may have wet my lips as one does, but I prefer a man's draught. Graves looked up. Who stood nearest Mrs. Linton when her cup was poured? The Colonel frowned.
I couldn't say.
I'd stepped to the fireplace. The smoke was infernal. Very good.
You may go, not far, Graves added, with a pointed politeness that made the Colonel snort. Reverend Pottle came in with the air of a man anxious to be helpful and mortally afraid of being thought otherwise.
His face was pale with earnestness. His fingers fretted the brim of his hat. "I must protest the insinuations, Inspector," he began tremulously.
"I am a shepherd of souls, not a tea poisoner." "Who said you were?"
said Graves, not unkindly. "Sit down, Vicar. Tell us what you noticed last night." "I noticed sin," the Reverend replied, catching Miss Marple's eye and colouring again. "Not in the usual sense, but the sin of secrets." Mrs. Linton had the air of one pursued by an invisible adversary. She looked often at the clock, and when the post arrived, she turned.
"Ashen," he gulped.
I begged her to take comfort. She said, "It is too late for comfort. The past has a taste." Then she drank her tea. "Did you drink yours, Reverend?"
asked Miss Marple lightly. "I did."
2 lumps of sugar, a little cream." He looked contrite. "I am partial to sweetness. It is a weakness I have acknowledged before God." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "The bowl of sugar. Did you lift the tongs to take your lumps?"
"I did, madam." "Before or after Mrs. Linton?"
He hesitated.
"After, I think."
Her ladyship poured first for her. She was the guest of honour. I took my cup a few moments later. I remember because Colonel Fawkes was telling a story about a camel in Cairo, and I did not wish to laugh and spill it. "And did you notice anything on the tongs?" Miss Marple asked.
"Any powder, perhaps?"
"No," said the Reverend with mild surprise. "They were clean as a whistle." He looked suddenly distressed. "Have I said something I oughtn't?" "You have said something very useful," Miss Marple replied. "Thank you." Graves made a small sound and wrote clumsily in his book, "Powder after," before. He did not like enigmas that looked like teacups. Lydia Crane entered last, slight and composed as if fear had frozen to a shell around her. Her eyes had the odd sheen of a person who has slept but not found rest. "Miss Crane," said Graves, "you mentioned a letter last night. You recognized your late uncle's hand." She nodded. "I did." "Your uncle, Mr. Linton, has been dead 3 years?" "Yes." "Then how, in your estimation, did he contrive to write to his widow?" Lydia's mouth trembled.
"I don't know."
Perhaps it was a copy of something old. Did you see the contents?"
"No, only the envelope."
"It lay on the mantel."
"When I glanced again, it was folded, Waffer, and when the inspector opened it, it was empty." Miss Marple folded her hands.
"Who stood near the mantel between those 2 moments, my dear?" Lydia glanced down. "The Colonel fetched a cigar from the hall and paused there." The Reverend looked at the clock.
And I myself stood near it."
"I did not touch the letter." "Was Mrs. Linton expecting a letter?"
asked Miss Marple. Lydia answered after a moment.
"She had asked earlier in the day if there was post. Twice, I think." "That will do, Miss Crane," said Graves, with a touch of kindness. "We'll ask you to remain in the house today." She nodded and slipped away, as silently as a thought one does not wish to examine. When the interviews were done, the house surrendered its plan to them, corridors like veins running from heart-room to extremity, the green baize door leading to the service passage, the sideboard in the little antechamber where Mr. Chivers kept his good spoons and Mrs. Dalloway kept her keys, the broad staircase to the landing where last night a door had clicked shut. Miss Marple and Inspector Graves walked it together. "There," said Miss Marple, touching the polished banister. "You may always know a house by its stairs. Folk with heavy consciences go lightly on them." Graves gave a brief grin in spite of himself. "And what do you make of our folk?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "we have among us one for whom the past is not a place but a person." Mrs. Linton said as much to the Reverend. "The past has a taste." A curious phrase, Inspector. And apropos, for what, after all, tastes more insistently of the past than almond? She paused, then added softly, "And yet there is a difficulty." "What difficulty?" "You took no sugar," Graves frowned. "We've been over that." "Yes, but think. If the poison were on the sugar tongs, as the powder suggests, then it is more likely to have been transferred to the Reverend's sugar than to Mrs. Linton's plain tea. Unless we suppose the murderer dusted the tongs before Lady Hesketh poured for Mrs. Linton, then wiped them or allowed the powder to be depleted before the Reverend took his share. But the Reverend says he noticed nothing on the tongs. Powder clings.
It is not fastidious. Graves rubbed his jaw.
You think the tongs are a decoy? I think, said Miss Marple, they are a riddle whose answer is not yet given. They entered the drawing-room, now pale in autumn light. The mantel clock ticked equably, as if time were neither ally nor enemy. Miss Marple went straight to the fireplace and with a small poker stirred the ash. Graves, startled, said, "Now, Miss Marple." But she had already knelt and drawn from the greying embers a minute blackened scrap of paper. She laid it on the marble and breathed gently across it. There was a sigh of ash. A ghost of letters emerged. "It is the merest fragment," she murmured. "But look, the tail of a Y, perhaps, and the cross of a T, no, a bar. And there, the curl of an ampersand, or the flourish of a signature." She looked up at Graves. "Someone burned what ought not to exist." "Could be the missing letter," Graves admitted, excitement tamped down by habit. "We'll send it to the lab." "Do," said Miss Marple, but her attention had gone to the empty envelope on the mantel. She lifted it. "Inspector, may we try a little experiment?" He raised a brow. "At your service." Miss Marple set the envelope near the candle flame until it warmed. She did not scorch it. She only encouraged it to remember that fire exists. As the paper grew faintly warm, a pale, spectral tracery emerged upon its inner flap. Lines that were not ink, but a blush in the fibres themselves. Graves leaned in. "What in God's name—" "Sympathetic ink," Miss Marple said softly. "Lemon juice, most likely, though there are other kitchen contrivances. The writing appears with heat." They watched as a few hesitating words came to light. "At 9, Teapot, forgive, A." Then the ghostly letters faded, as if shy of daylight. Graves whistled under his breath. So there was writing. "An inner writing," Miss Marple corrected. The letter was meant to be read thus, warmed by a candle, perhaps, when no one looked. Someone knew it, and burned the leaf before it could be read.
"But the envelope—" "They forgot the envelope. Forgive A," Graves repeated. "For Amelia?"
"Or for another name, or for a place," said Miss Marple. "People forget that places sign their names in ways too." She turned the envelope over. "No stamp, hand-delivered, and yet Miss Crane says it arrived with the post." Graves scowled. "Chivers collects the post from the gate. We'll ask him." They did, and Mr. Chivers, affronted by the implication of error, declared stoutly that he had gone at 8:30 to the box at the lane, collected one letter, a bill for the housekeeper, and 2 newspapers, and nothing else. He had given these to Mrs. Dalloway. He had not set foot in the drawing-room after placing the tea-tray. "Then," said Miss Marple, when he had withdrawn, "this envelope did not come by the post at all." Miss Crane said she saw it arrive. Graves objected. "She said she saw it," Miss Marple corrected. "Young ladies sometimes mistake the arrival of an object for the moment it first strikes their attention." Graves grunted. "We've another puzzle. If the poison wasn't the sugar and the letter wasn't from the post, how the devil—" "Let us be childlike," Miss Marple suggested. "With riddles, one must count fingers."
"Let us count."
What could carry hydrocyanic acid to a human mouth at 9 o'clock? The tea, present for all. The cream, used by many. The sugar, used by some. The cup itself, used by one. A scent, possibly upon a handkerchief. A drop painted on the rim.
A seed in a cake.
But the scent lingers and others would notice. The rim shows a stain if not applied with cruel neatness.
"And the macaroons." She paused, a thought kindling. "Macaroons did Miss Crane say she fetched for the Reverend?"
"She did, too. And who baked them? Mrs. Brabazon." "Macaroons," Miss Marple mused, "are made with bitter almond, in small, harmless quantities."
"But extract—" She shook her head.
"No. Mrs. Brabazon's pride in her kitchen is of the kind that does not measure with a liberal hand. Besides, others ate them. Graves, who had a soldier's impatience for airy ideas, returned to the ground.
The cup.
You saw last night that Mrs. Linton's cup was poured last. Yes. And you know how, when a pot is nearly empty, the last pour is the strongest. If a small amount of poison were placed in the spout of the pot, say with a fine brush, it might remain there until the final tilt. The person who receives the last cup receives the death. Graves stared.
By Jove!
Simple as blackberry jam, Miss Marple said mildly. But the spout was clean when you tested it. So it was. The pot's been rinsed since the act. By whom? Graves swore softly. Chivers says he sealed the tray.
I'll have the constable who stood guard explain himself. Yet even as he spoke, Miss Marple was looking not at the pot, but at the cream jug, whose lip gleamed like a smile too white to be sincere.
We should test the jug as well, Inspector. We have, he said. Nothing. Then I propose we step away from objects and look at time. Who stood where and when? They reconstructed. The evening like a child laying out picture cards. 8:45, the guests gathered in the drawing-room after supper. Mrs. Linton asked about the post. At 9, sir, the clock struck. Tea was brought in by Elsie. Lady Hesketh poured for Mrs. Linton last. Colonel Fawkes moved to the hearth. Reverend Pottle hovered by the piano. Lydia Crane watched the mantel. The letter, the envelope, was noticed then. Somebody must have placed it there between 8:45 and 9. Somebody in that room at 9:05 Mrs. Linton drank. She spoke to the vicar. It is too late for comfort. The past has a taste. She took another sip. At 9:10, 9:12, Elsie went to fetch the good spoons by order of Lady Hesketh. During her absence, the position shifted. Colonel Fawkes crossed to the mantel. The Reverend tested a chord at the piano. Lydia fetched a shawl for Mrs. Linton. At 9:15, 9:20, the symptoms appeared. Death followed quickly. Elsie returned, screamed, "Confusion!" Graves, who had been putting pins in a mental map, now frowned. "I want that letter accounted for. The invisible writing came at 9, Teapot, forgive, A. Suppose it was a message to warn her, or to accuse her. Either way, the person who wrote it was in the house." "Not necessarily wrote," Miss Marple murmured.
Copied, perhaps. By God, Graves said. The niece saw her late uncle's handwriting.
"Someone could have traced it to frighten the widow." "You may confirm that with a handwriting man," Miss Marple said, "but I think so. Fear is a most efficient poison when one wishes to direct the eyes of a room." There was a pause. The house held its breath. Through the window came the wet shine of the lawns and the slow drift of a cloud that had run out of rain. "Miss Marple," Graves said, "quieter. What do you suppose Mrs. Linton meant? The past has a taste." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Guilt has its kitchen, Inspector. There is a sort of person who carries the taste of a deed upon the tongue for years. Makes them particular about flavours. Some take no sugar because sweetness reminds them too nearly of the false words they once spoke. Some take only bitter to keep faith with their remorse. But it may be simpler. She might have meant the almond taste itself." They walked to the doorway of the drawing-room. On the landing above, the door that had clicked last night stood ajar. Miss Marple mounted the steps. Graves followed. It was a small sitting-room, unused save for a sewing basket, and a faint, clean smell of furniture polish. On a little table by the window stood a glass bottle labelled Laurel Water. Graves picked it up. "What's this?" "Cherry laurel water," Miss Marple said. "A relic of old English kitchens and old English headaches. It was once used for flavouring Kieran for indispositions. A few drops are harmless. More is not. It contains hydrocyanic acid." Graves swore softly again. "Whose is it?" Mrs. Dalloway, upon being fetched, put her hand to her throat. "That's the late Sir Hubert's remedy. He swore by it for a bilious turn. We've kept it there for yonks, sir."
I had no notion it were dangerous. Not dangerous, Miss Marple corrected gently.
"Only honest. It says what it is if one knows how to listen." Graves looked bleakly at the bottle. "So the poison was in the house all along?" as such things so often are. He replaced the bottle and, after a moment's hesitation, locked the room. We'll keep that safe. God knows we've enough poison to hand without leaving decanters of it about. They went back down to the drawing-room. Lady Hesketh came in with a fragile courage that made Miss Marple feel kindly toward her.
Inspector, this cannot go on. My guests, my niece, the house is unstrung.
You must tell me something certain. We'll tell you when we've something certain to tell, Graves said, not unkindly. For now, nobody leaves. Lady Hesketh stiffened.
Nobody? Nobody! She pressed her handkerchief to her lips and nodded.
Very well, very well. When she had gone, the quiet settled again. The candle on the mantel wavered in a current of air that no one could feel. Miss Marple drew a little nearer to it and stood for a moment with her hands folded, looking at the tea tray beneath its bell jar, at the envelope that had revealed and concealed, at the chairs placed as memories said they had been, at the window which had welcomed rain and might, in another season, have welcomed roses. One must think quietly, she told herself, as a gardener thinks over bulbs in winter. They look dead, but they are not. Somewhere beneath the soil, a shape is already deciding itself. She closed her eyes. The sugar tongs, the powder on the tip, that is a flourish, an embroidery to draw attention to the bowl. But the one who died took no sugar. So why the powder? Perhaps because one expected her to, and only at the last minute remembered or noticed. And the poison must travel another way. The spout, the rim, the cup, the cream.
The envelope?
She opened her eyes. There is also the matter of the letter, and of the hour it names. At 9, teapot, forgive, A, either a warning to avoid the teapot at 9, or a confession that the teapot at 9 would be the instrument. But then why write to the victim at all? Because one cannot help wanting to be known. Because guilt is a kind of love for one's own wrongdoing. She felt, rather than saw, someone in the doorway. Lydia Crane stood there, her face a little too composed. "I beg your pardon," Lydia said softly.
"I thought you might be here," Miss Marple smiled.
"Come, my dear, sit. Have you breakfasted?"
"No, I cannot eat." Lydia's gaze fell to the envelope. "Is it true, then, that there was invisible writing?"
"It is true." Lydia clasped her hands.
"And the A? Does it mean Amelia?" "It could," Miss Marple said.
"Or it could mean Andrew, Arthur, anger, atonement. Letters are generous things. They lend themselves to more than one word." Lydia's composure fractured briefly. She was frightened, Miss Marple, all day. When she thought no one was looking, she would stare at the tea set as if it were accusing her.
"Do you think she had done something terrible?"
Miss Marple laid a hand across hers. "We all have done things that look terrible from the right angle. The question is not what she did, but who wanted her dead for it." Lydia looked down.
"I must tell you something. Uncle's death, there was talk in London."
That he had not only debts, but enemies. That the crash and the scandal were not entirely clean. Aunt Amelia bore it bravely. But there was a gentleman, Mr. Havisham, who believed Uncle had wronged him. He wrote dreadful letters by the end.
"I don't know what became of him." "Thank you, my dear."
It is a good thing to put real names to shadows.
"It makes them less inclined to grow." When Lydia had gone, Inspector Graves returned with the labman's early word on the powder.
"Traces of cyanide," he said grimly.
"On the sugar tongs." Miss Marple's eyes did not change.
"How very convenient of our murderer to confirm his stage direction." Graves sat. "You think it's misdirection?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that anyone rash enough to dust the tongs would by nature be cruder than the one who wrote with lemon and burned the leaf. And yet our criminal seems to be both crude and delicate."
"Unless—" She paused, looking not at Graves but at the mantel clock.
"Unless there are two hands," Graves stared. "Two? One hand that wished the death, and one that wished to be seen wishing it. Or one that wished to warn and one that wished to kill." She smiled faintly. "I am very fond, Inspector, of double knitting. The front shows roses, the back shows thorns." He rose without comment, heavy with thought. In the corridor, a constable's boots sounded and faded. In the far garden, a rook called mournfully, as rooks do, who are often suspected of entirely human crimes. Just as Graves reached the door, Miss Marple said, "One more small question, if you please. Last night, when Elsie went for the good spoons, who asked her to go? Lady Hesketh. Yes, and why?" Graves blinked. "Because she wanted the good spoons, do you see?" Miss Marple's voice was still very soft. At that moment, with tea just poured, the request removed the maid from the room. For a minute or two, a minute in which cups could be exchanged, or a rim traced, or a letter warmed by the fire. Graves looked back at the mantel, at the envelope that had, indeed, been warmed by a flame in someone's hand.
"You think her ladyship—"
"I think," Miss Marple said, "that we must not think yet. We must watch. We must let people do what they do when they believe they have been clever." He nodded slowly. "Very well, we'll watch." He left her there with the calm and the clock and the candle, and Miss Marple allowed herself one last quiet moment by the fire. She knelt and stirred the ash once more. A tiny pin, blackened and bent, winked back at her. The sort of pin a lady might use to fix a veil to a hat, or a piece of orange peel to the spout of a pot to perfume the poor. She lifted it with a handkerchief and placed it on the mantel by the envelope, as if arranging a still life. There is always a hand that steadies the spout, she thought, and sometimes that hand belongs to someone who believes themselves incapable of murder. Behind her, the clock chimed the quarter hour, and as though answering it, from somewhere deep in the house there was a single, crystalline sound, the tinkle of porcelain against stone. 2 heartbeats later, a constable shouted. Miss Marple and Graves were in the corridor at once. On the tiles by the green baize door lay a shattered teacup, not of last night's set, but an older piece, hairline cracked and worn, and beside it a damp cloth that smelled faintly, unmistakably, of bitter almond. Graves swore. "Someone's washing something." Miss Marple, very calm, bent to the cloth. "Not washing, Inspector, erasing." Yet as they looked up, the corridor was empty. The baize door swayed a little, as if someone had just passed through, and the air had not yet decided whether to follow. They were not, Miss Marple thought, dealing with a murderer content to rest upon a single act. There was industry here, the tidying mind that cannot bear an untidiness of means. That was, in its way, more alarming than rage. Back in the drawing-room, the candle's flame fluttered as though in private laughter. On the mantel, the envelope's pale letters had faded again to secrecy, and the little blackened pin lay like a punctuation mark at the end of an unfinished sentence, and somewhere, perhaps on the landing where the door had clicked, perhaps in the kitchen where the blue sugar tin stood innocent and unknowing, a second hand moved across the page of the day's design. The past had a taste. The present, Miss Marple thought, had one too, and it was growing stronger. Chapter 3. The morning passed into a long, muted afternoon. Outside, the clouds had torn themselves into pale ribbons, and sunlight fell reluctantly through the misted windows of Hazelworth Grange, as though reluctant to touch a house where death had sat to tea. The world went on, birds calling faintly beyond the hedgerows, the carriage road gleaming with rain, but within those panelled walls, time seemed to pause, holding its breath. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting, a soft, unthreatening figure in grey wool. To the unobservant, she might have seemed a kindly old lady content with her needles and yarn. But beneath that serene exterior, her mind was moving, delicately, meticulously, threading motive through opportunity, past through present, until the pattern began to glimmer through. Inspector Graves entered quietly, brushing mud from his boots. "We've checked the servants' quarters. Found nothing new. But someone's been tampering in the scullery, but that broken cup we found was part of a set from Lady Hesketh's private china cabinet."
"Locked, or supposed to be?" Miss Marple looked up mildly.
"Supposed, yes. Locks are like consciences, Inspector. Quite effective until one decides to ignore them. He gave a small grunt. "We've also turned up this." He laid a small bottle on the table, brown glass, with a torn chemist's label.
Laurel water again, but this one's half empty. Miss Marple's eyes rested upon it. Half empty, you say?
How curious. And yet there's the other bottle in the upstairs sitting room, quite full. So one might almost believe that someone poured a little from one into the other. Or poured a little into a teapot, Graves muttered. Perhaps, she said gently. But we must ask why. Poison, Inspector, is a very intimate weapon. One must trust proximity. There are easier ways to kill, he frowned. Then you think this wasn't hatred? I think it was personal, Miss Marple replied, but not necessarily born of rage. There is guilt here, heavy, festering guilt.
One can smell it in the corridors.
People whisper too softly. They walk as though the walls might listen. Graves sighed, running a hand through his hair. You mean someone's protecting someone? Or pretending to, said Miss Marple, which is often the same thing. At luncheon, Lady Hesketh insisted that her guests gather at the table, for propriety's sake. The table was long and gleaming, laid with fine china that none of them could look at without recalling last night's horror. Colonel Fawkes carved the roast with military aggression. The Reverend Pottle murmured grace, his hands shaking. Lydia Crane nibbled at bread, pale and absent, really.
Inspector, Lady Hesketh declared, her voice trembling somewhere between indignation and nerves.
I cannot understand why this house must be treated as a jail. The sooner you catch whoever did this dreadful thing, the better for all concerned. Graves said nothing, merely making a note in his book. Miss Marple buttered a scone with slow precision. You must forgive the inspector, Lady Hesketh.
He is like a doctor who must listen to everyone's heartbeat before he can decide whose is irregular. The Colonel barked a short laugh. Ah, well said, ma'am.
Though I dare say he'll find plenty irregular pulses today. Lydia looked sharply at him. You speak as if we were all diseased. He met her gaze.
I speak as one who dislikes being kept under suspicion. Especially when I've nothing to hide, Miss Marple smiled faintly.
My dear Colonel, those with nothing to hide are often the first to assure others of it. The Reverend dabbed at his mouth nervously. We must all have faith in Providence. Surely the Lord will not permit the guilty to escape. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, I dare say Providence requires a little assistance now and then.
After all, he must work with rather human material. The conversation faltered.
Cutlery clinked softly. Then Lydia spoke, hesitantly.
Aunt Amelia.
She said something strange to me yesterday afternoon. We were walking by the rose garden and she stopped quite suddenly. She said, Lydia, never drink what is offered in kindness. It may be the cruelest thing of all. I laughed, thinking it was one of her melancholy remarks. But now, her voice broke. Lady Hesketh shuddered. Oh, my dear child, don't dwell upon it. Miss Marple leaned forward gently. And had Mrs. Linton seemed
agitated before she said it? Yes, Lydia whispered.
She had received a letter that morning, the first one, before the invisible one.
I saw her tear it in half and throw it into the fire.
When I asked, she said it was old business. Did you notice the handwriting? Lydia hesitated.
It was the same, Aki, the same as Uncle Linton's. Graves stiffened. But you said he's dead. Yes, Lydia said quietly.
But Aunt Amelia never believed it. She said there were debts unpaid, not money, but forgiveness. She said, when forgiveness is owed, it always finds its way to you, like a letter with no return address. Miss Marple's needles paused. How very poetic of her, and inconveniently accurate. That evening the inspector received a telegram. He read it by lamplight, lips tightening. From London Yard, he said.
On your suggestion, Miss Marple, we checked into Mrs. Linton's late husband's affairs.
Seems you were right. Quite the scandal. Misappropriated trust funds, false accounts, the lot. Bank collapsed, a few families ruined. One of them, a Mr. Havisham, drank himself to death within a year. Miss Marple's face softened.
Poor man.
And yet grief sometimes breeds other kinds of heirs. Vengeance, for one, Graves nodded grimly. And you're like this.
Havisham had a son, Arthur Havisham.
age 32, disappeared from London about a month ago. As dusk fell, Miss Marple asked for a candle and a moment alone in the drawing-room. The servants, uneasy, obeyed. She lit the candle, its flame reflected in the silver tray where Mrs. Linton had taken her final tea. The faint scent of bergamot lingered still, though the air was heavy with silence. At 9. Teapot. Forgive. A. She murmured the words aloud, letting them hang in the stillness. Then she drew from her pocket the little blackened pin found in the hearth. Holding it to the light, she saw a film, so faint it was almost invisible, clinging to its surface, a trace of dried liquid, glossy and dark. She touched it lightly to her tongue.
Instantly her face creased. "Almonds," she whispered.
And something else, the tang of metal, a footstep behind her. She turned. Candlelight trembling, it was Lydia, pale, hollow-eyed,
a shawl wrapped tight about her shoulders. "Oh, Miss Marple, I couldn't sleep."
Every sound feels like it's watching me. Fear does that, my dear. Sharpens the senses until one hears one's own conscience breathing. Lydia's eyes brimmed.
"You think I did it, don't you?"
Miss Marple regarded her kindly.
"I think you're afraid of something."
But fear and guilt are cousins, not twins. Lydia sank into a chair.
"I didn't poison her, but I did something foolish."
I found the letter, the one with the invisible writing, before she read it.
I was curious.
I held it near the candle. When the words appeared, I panicked.
I thought it was a threat.
So I put it back before she could see. "And who was near you when you did this?" "Lady Hesketh," Lydia whispered. She came in just as I dropped the letter.
She saw me but said nothing, only smiled. Miss Marple's expression did not change. A curious sort of smile.
Yes, the kind people wear when they've already guessed what frightens you. Later, when the house had retired, Miss Marple found Inspector Graves in the study, poring over reports. "Inspector," she said quietly, "we must tread very softly now. The murderer knows we are close, and close people are dangerous."
"I should like your men to remain visible, but inattentive."
"Let our culprit think the storm has passed," Graves frowned. "You're planning something." "Only to watch," she said.
"A trap does not spring itself, Inspector."
"It must first be baited with vanity," he sighed. "Very well, Miss Marple."
"What do you need?"
"Only a teapot," she said, smiling faintly, "and a little courage." That night, as the wind rose again beyond the windows, the Grange lay still. But beneath its quiet surface, every heartbeat to its own secret rhythm. Guilt, fear, hope, and the desperate longing not to be found out. And, somewhere in that sleeping house, a hand moved once more toward a cup. The same hand that had killed, now reaching to protect itself. The candle on Miss Marple's table burned low, its flame thin and silver as a whisper. At 9, Teapot, forgive, A. The words echoed softly through her thoughts. Forgive. She closed her eyes. Yes, she thought, but first, confess. Chapter 5 starts. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Too bright, perhaps, for a house still wrapped in the shroud of death. The rain had washed the gardens clean, leaving every blade of grass shining like cut glass beneath the autumn sun. But inside Hazelworth Grange, curtains were drawn, voices hushed, and the scent of candle wax clung like a memory that refused to fade. Inspector Graves stood at the breakfast table, arms folded, his brow furrowed over a spread of notes. Miss Marple, unhurried as ever, poured herself a small cup of tea. "I've been thinking, Inspector," she said mildly, "about our friend Mrs. Linton. I believe she was expecting something last night. Not death, precisely, but reckoning." Graves glanced up. "You mean she knew someone meant to confront her?" "Not confront," Miss Marple replied softly. "Reveal."
"One does not write forgive to a person one intends only to frighten."
"That word belongs to the guilty, not the vengeful," Graves frowned. Then you think Mrs. Linton herself was the one who wrote it? Oh, no, Miss Marple said with a faint smile.
I think she was the one being asked to forgive.
Which in its way is worse. Forgiveness is a door some souls cannot bear to open, especially when the one knocking has already done them harm. The inspector sighed. You do make murder sound like theology, Miss Marple. Well, she replied, sipping delicately, in many ways it is. By mid-morning, a constable arrived from London bearing a small packet, the laboratory's final report. Graves unfolded it at once. Traces of hydrocyanic acid found on the inside rim of Mrs. Linton's cup. Not in the tea itself, Miss Marple nodded.
Ah, so the poison was painted on.
Perhaps with something quite ordinary. A hat pin or a hair pin or indeed a veil pin, Graves blinked. The pin you found in the grate. Just so, she said softly. And do you recall, Inspector, who wore a hat that evening? He rubbed his chin.
Most of the ladies, I think.
Lady Hesketh certainly. She's rarely without one of those feathered things. And Lydia? She wore none indoors. Said her head ached. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Indeed. Then perhaps we should look at the feathered things more closely. They found Lady Hesketh in the morning room, dictating a letter to her companion. A nervous young woman with ink on her fingers and fear in her eyes. Lady Hesketh greeted them with brittle composure. Inspector Miss Marple, how perfectly exhausting all this must be for you.
I trust we're nearing the end of it.
Nearer than you think, ma'am, Graves replied. Might we trouble you for the hat you wore last evening?
My hat?
She repeated, startled. Whatever for? It's become something of a curiosity to us, Miss Marple said gently. You see, we've reason to believe a certain pin may have been used in the commission of this dreadful business. And one always associates pins with hats, does one not? Lady Hesketh hesitated, colour rising. Good heavens, Miss Marple, you cannot suspect me of such a monstrous act. Miss Marple's expression remained kind. Oh, no, Lady Hesketh.
Not suspect.
Merely observe. After a pause, the lady rang for her maid. The hat, a fine creation of black velvet and egret plume, was brought forth in its box. Graves examined it perfunctorily, then handed it to Miss Marple. The old lady turned it over in her hands, fingertips light, eyes sharp. Ah, here we are. She drew out a long, slender veil pin. The tip was slightly dulled, and when she held it near the light, a faint discoloration showed, a tarnish of unnatural dull blue. Inspector, she murmured, perhaps you'd be so good as to test this? Graves looked grim.
If this comes back positive. But Lady Hesketh had risen, trembling. This is absurd.
That pin hasn't left my hat since last week.
I haven't touched it.
Miss Marple's tone remained calm.
Perhaps not, my dear lady.
But someone else may have. When you asked the maid to fetch the good spoons, the room was briefly unsupervised. The hat stood upon the console near the piano. One might, without difficulty, lift such a pin and use it, ever so delicately, to anoint the rim of a teacup. Lady Hesketh clutched her pearls.
You suggest one of my guests handle my hat?
Or perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, one of your family. The results came swiftly. The veil pin carried traces of prussic acid. The house erupted in whispers. Servants exchanged wide-eyed looks in corridors. The colonel stormed up and down the library like a caged bear. Lydia Crane shut herself in her room. Inspector Graves pressed his advantage.
Lady Hesketh, someone in your household used that pin to poison Mrs. Linton. We've evidence enough for that. She looked stricken.
But who?
Who would dare such a thing, under my roof?
Miss Marple's gaze was gentle. Perhaps someone who feared what Mrs. Linton might reveal. Someone who had more to lose than reputation. The silence that followed was brittle as glass. At length, Lady Hesketh whispered, You must not speak ill of Lydia. The poor child has suffered enough. Then you think she could have done it? Graves pressed. Lady Hesketh's hand trembled against her pearls. No, but I fear she believes she did. Miss Marple looked up sharply. Believes?
Yes, Lady Hesketh said, tears welling.
She came to me last night. Said she had touched the teacup by mistake, that she meant to help Mrs. Linton because her hand was shaking, but that she might have done something dreadful instead.
Oh, Miss Marple, I told her it was nonsense, but she looked so pale, as though she were already condemned. Miss Marple folded her hands. Ah, that explains a good deal, Graves frowned.
What do you mean? She was being protected, Inspector, Miss Marple said softly, by someone who understood guilt and how to use it. That evening, as the sun went down behind the distant hills, Miss Marple took a walk through the gardens. The air smelled of damp earth and lavender, and the gravel crunched softly underfoot. She paused by the rose garden, where the last blooms of autumn trembled in the fading light. A small bench stood there, and upon it sat Lydia Crane, her face buried in her hands. Miss Marple approached quietly.
It's a peaceful spot, isn't it?
Lydia looked up, startled, then gave a broken laugh. Peaceful? Yes, if one hasn't blood on one's conscience. My dear, Miss Marple said gently, the truly guilty seldom speak of blood. They prefer the word accident. Lydia shuddered. I told her not to drink.
I begged her.
But she said forgiveness must be swallowed whole, even if it burns. She meant poison?
Lydia's eyes filled. I don't know what she meant.
She was shaking, and when she lifted her cup, I reached out, just to steady it. And then she looked at me with such horror, as if she'd seen her own sin in my face.
I didn't poison her, Miss Marple, I swear it.
I know, my dear, Miss Marple said softly.
You did not poison her.
But you may have witnessed who did. Lydia's lips parted.
Who? Think, said Miss Marple.
When you reached for the cup, who else stood near? You said your aunt looked past you, but someone behind you. Lydia closed her eyes, memory trembling. Yes, she did. She looked over my shoulder at the door.
I thought she was frightened.
And there was movement, a shadow perhaps.
I thought it was Lady Hesketh. Miss Marple's voice was very quiet.
Or someone who wished to look like her. By nightfall, the pieces had begun to move in earnest. Inspector Graves gathered everyone in the drawing-room, the long chamber, once so bright with firelight and laughter, now cold with waiting. The clock ticked steadily. The curtains stirred. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graves began, "we've nearly reached the end of this business. We've evidence, not yet conclusive, but close. And I intend to have the truth before this night is over." Miss Marple rose from her chair by the hearth.
Indeed you shall, Inspector.
But the truth is not a thing to be forced. It must be revealed as one reveals invisible ink. She turned toward Lady Hesketh. "Would you be so kind, madam, as to light the candle on the mantel?" Bewildered, Lady Hesketh did so. The old detective took from her reticule the scorched envelope, the one that had once held the message. Now she said softly, "If we warm this once more." The invisible words appeared again, faintly glowing in the flickering light. "At 9, Teapot, forgive A." Lady Hesketh gasped. "Arthur Havisham." Miss Marple's gaze was steady.
Yes, the son of the man your late friend's husband ruined.
He sought her forgiveness, but came instead to find justice.
And yet...
She paused, eyes moving over the assembled faces. "Mr. Havisham is not here." "No," Graves said grimly. "And I'll wager he never was." "Quite so," said Miss Marple. "Because Arthur Havisham is dead." The room froze. "Dead?" Graves echoed. Miss Marple nodded. "He drowned himself in the Serpentine a fortnight ago."
"I wired London last night."
But his letters continued. "Someone here knew of his death and used his name as a mask." A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Hesketh sank into her chair. Lydia covered her mouth. Miss Marple's voice grew softer.
"Forgive! Not Arthur. Agnes." Lady Hesketh looked up sharply. "Agnes?"
"Your companion," Miss Marple said gently, turning to the nervous young woman with ink-stained fingers. "You were once a governess in the Havisham household, were you not? You knew Arthur and Amelia Linton. You saw what her husband's deceit did to that family. And when Arthur took his life, you blamed her. but your conscience was too tender for revenge. You wrote to her, not to kill but to warn.
Yet someone intercepted your letter. Agnes trembled.
I only wanted her to repent, to forgive him.
I thought if she read it, she might confess what her husband had done.
But when she died... She broke off, sobbing. Miss Marple laid a hand upon her arm. You did not kill her, my dear. Someone used your letter. Someone who needed it as a veil for their own crime. Inspector Graves turned slowly toward Lady Hesketh, and who in this house had access to every letter, every guest, every detail of last night's supper. Lady Hesketh's face had gone white. No, she whispered. You can't mean... Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, my lady, yourself. A gasp went round the room. You received Agnes's letter first, Miss Marple continued. You saw the hidden words, knew the hour, 9 o'clock, and the mention of the teapot.
You feared Amelia Linton would reveal the truth, that your late husband,
Sir Hubert, was one of the men her husband defrauded, and that you, desperate to preserve your fortune, had accepted her silence in exchange for her friendship. You invited her here not out of kindness, but out of fear. Lady Hesketh rose, trembling violently.
You dare accuse me? You poisoned her, my lady, Miss Marple said quietly.
But not with hatred, with dread. You meant only to silence her, not to kill. But poison, like truth, rarely stops where one intends it. Lady Hesketh's hand flew to her throat.
I only brushed the cup. A drop, no more.
She was to feel ill, to leave, to forget.
I never meant... Her voice broke. The Colonel caught her arm as she swayed.
Good God, woman! Miss Marple closed her eyes.
Ah, but that is the tragedy of genteel crime, Colonel.
It begins with fear and ends with ruin. The inspector gave a heavy sigh.
You'll have to come with me, my lady. Lady Hesketh bowed her head.
Yes, I know. The candle flickered as she was led away, its flame bending in the draught like a soul resisting judgment. Miss Marple stood very still. The silence, they gathered reluctantly, Lady Hesketh pale but defiant, the Reverend Pottle clutching his Bible like a talisman, the Colonel scowling, Lydia trembling as though each sound might shatter her. Miss Marple began to pour. Lady Hesketh, she said softly, you first, since it was you who last presided at this little ceremony. The woman hesitated, then accepted the cup with shaking hands. Next came Lydia. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle as she passed the second cup. Then the Reverend,
murmuring a prayer under his breath. Then Colonel Fawkes,
muttering, "This is infernal nonsense." Finally, Miss Marple poured one for herself and set the teapot down. "Now," she said quietly. We wait. The silence was suffocating. The clock ticked, the fire hissed, someone's breath caught. Nothing happened. Miss Marple smiled. "There, you see."
Entirely safe, Graves exhaled sharply.
"Well, that's a relief." But Miss Marple raised a hand.
Not quite, Inspector.
The tea was never meant to harm, only to invite memory, because I have found that guilt, like sugar, dissolves best in something hot. Her eyes moved to Lady Hesketh. "My lady, I must thank you. Your confession yesterday was brave, but incomplete. You see, you were not the only hand that touched that cup." Lady Hesketh flinched. "You're mistaken." "I rarely am," Miss Marple said mildly. "There was another hand, one younger, steadier, and more deliberate. The hand that painted the rim, not brushed it. The hand that later tried to wash away the evidence." "Lydia," a murmur went up. Lydia's cup slipped from her fingers and shattered. "No!" she gasped.
"It isn't true. I didn't mean... I thought she'd hurt Aunt Hesketh. She said terrible things. She said she'd ruin us all."
Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost tender. "You meant to protect her. You thought Mrs. Linton's death would prevent scandal, the same way Lady Hesketh once thought silence could protect her."
"You are both victims of the same illusion, my dear. That truth can be tidied away like a spilled drop of tea." Lydia shook her head wildly. "I only touched the cup. I didn't know there was poison."
"Perhaps not the first time." Miss Marple said softly. "But when you saw your aunt replace the pin when you smelt the almond, you knew."
You could have stopped her. Instead, you let Mrs. Linton drink. Lydia's sobs filled the still room. Lady Hesketh reached for her, whispering brokenly, "My child, I thought you were in bed." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered.
"She wasn't, my lady. She was in the doorway. She saw what you did, and later, when the panic came, she helped you destroy the evidence, the cup, the cloth, the fire. She believed herself complicit. But you see, Inspector, she is not the murderer. She is merely the conscience." Graves stepped forward, grave-faced. "Then who?" Miss Marple turned toward the Reverend Pottle. "Reverend," she said gently, "you told us you took 2 lumps of sugar. But when we examined the sugar bowl, we found traces of poison on every lump. Yet you were unharmed. Do you know why?" The clergyman blinked rapidly, paling.
I don't, because you were the one who placed them there." He staggered back, face whitening.
"Good heavens, woman! Oh, you are very pious, Reverend," Miss Marple said softly. "Too pious. You pretended moral indignation, yet you were the first to declare that sin must be punished. You saw Mrs. Linton as the architect of another man's ruin. Your cousin, Arthur Havisham. You took his name to write the letter, hoping she would repent, and when she did not, you decided to hasten divine justice yourself." The Reverend's hands trembled violently.
No, she destroyed him. She deserved forgiveness," Miss Marple said.
"But you, sir, chose vengeance and called it righteousness. You poisoned the tongs, believing she would take sugar."
"When she did not, you panicked and seized Lady Hesketh's pin to finish what you'd begun." The man's composure cracked like glass. "I meant only to send her to judgment,"
he cried. Graves stepped forward, hand outstretched. "I think you'll find judgment comes later, Reverend. For now, it's the gallows." As the constables led him away, the Reverend's Bible fell to the floor, pages fluttering open to a single verse. "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." Miss Marple stooped, closed it gently, and placed it upon the table beside the teapot. "There are always 2 poisons, Inspector," she murmured. "One in the cup and one in the heart." Graves looked at her with weary admiration. "You never cease to amaze me, Miss Marple. I thought we'd reached the end last night." "So did the murderer," she said with a faint smile. "But you see, the truth always needs one final pour to clear the dregs." Chapter The Chaise. Morning after the Reverend's arrest dawned bleak and pale, the kind of morning when the world seems to hold its breath between guilt and redemption. The mist clung to the lawns like remorse, and the windows of Hazelworth Grange reflected nothing but their own weary grief. Inside, the great house had fallen quiet. The servants moved in whispers, as though the walls themselves might still be listening. In the drawing-room the hearth lay cold, the silver tea set now locked away as evidence, and beside the dying fire Miss Marple sat, a small figure wrapped in calm thought, her knitting folded neatly on her lap. Inspector Graves entered, his hat in his hands, his face drawn. "It's done," he said simply. "The Reverend's confessed?" Miss Marple looked up. "So soon?" "He broke within the hour," Graves replied. "Admitted to writing the letter. Said he'd used sympathetic ink because he wanted God's will revealed by fire. He poisoned the sugar, then panicked when Mrs. Linton refused it."
"After you found the powder on the tongs, he realized the game was up." Miss Marple nodded slowly.
"Yes. Guilt is a very impatient companion." Graves sank into the chair opposite her, rubbing his temples. "I've been at this business 20 years, Miss Marple, and I'll never understand it."
"A man of the cloth, preaching mercy every Sunday, and by Monday morning he's mixing cyanide with sugar." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Ah, but that is precisely the trouble with righteousness, Inspector."
Once one begins to see oneself as the hand of Providence, One soon forgets whose hand it truly is. Graves managed a weary smile.
You have a way of putting things, ma'am.
I suppose there's no mystery left now? Oh, Miss Marple murmured. There is always a little mystery left, usually in the hearts of those who survive. At Lady Hesketh's request, Miss Marple went to her room before luncheon. The once imperious woman sat by the window, the morning light falling cold upon her pale face. Her jewels lay discarded upon the vanity, her pearls like tears scattered across the dressing-table. "You have been very merciful, Miss Marple," she said softly, without turning.
I know what you think of me, that I was weak, cowardly, complicit.
And you were quite right. Miss Marple shook her head. You were human, my lady, and humanity, for all its faults, is rarely uninteresting. Lady Hesketh sighed. Do you think God will forgive me? Forgiveness, Miss Marple said gently, is like tea. It must be offered before it can be accepted. You must forgive yourself first. The woman gave a trembling smile.
I have spent so many years afraid of scandal and of what people might say.
And now I find the worst things are those we whisper only to ourselves. Quite so, Miss Marple said, rising. Confession is not only for the church, my lady. Sometimes it is for the mirror. Lydia Crane met Miss Marple in the hallway. Her eyes were red from tears, yet her face held a fragile calm. They're taking the Reverend away, she said quietly. He looked at me as though I had betrayed him. You merely told the truth, my dear, Miss Marple said.
And the truth is never betrayal, though it may feel like it at first. Lydia hesitated.
What will become of Lady Hesketh? She will not hang, Miss Marple said softly. Fear is punishment enough for her, and I imagine she will spend the rest of her days arranging charity luncheons to atone for a single tea. Lydia gave a faint, trembling laugh. You make it sound almost merciful. Mercy and justice, my dear, are two sides of the same coin. Flip it often enough, and one begins to look very much like the other. She reached out and touched the girl's hand. Go to London. Begin anew. There are better rooms than this to grow up in. Lydia's voice broke. Thank you, Miss Marple.
I don't deserve your kindness. Miss Marple smiled faintly.
Few of us do, my dear.
That is why it is kindness. That afternoon...
As the constables departed and the last of the police motors rolled away down the drive, the house exhaled as though relieved to be rid of human tragedy at last. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room. The windows were open now, the air cool and fresh. She stood before the mantel, gazing at the place where the teapot had once gleamed, where poison had masqueraded as hospitality. Graves joined her one final time. You'll be returning to St. Mary Mead, I suppose, he said. Yes, she replied. I have chrysanthemums to tend, and my vicarage needs dusting. One cannot neglect one's own parish for long, Inspector. He nodded. You've done us a great service. The men at the yard could learn a thing or two from you. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Oh, I doubt that. They already have the advantage of youth, muscles, and motor cars. I have only my knitting and the way people underestimate it. Graves laughed despite himself. You make it sound like a weapon. In a way it is, she said.
Every knot and every loop, a small act of patience.
And patience, Inspector, is the only thing cleverer than murder. He tipped his hat. Good day, Miss Marple. And to you, she said kindly. May your next case be less tragic, and your next cup of tea safer. That evening, long after the policeman had gone and the servants had retired, Miss Marple sat alone in her small guest room. A single candle flickered on the nightstand, its glow turning the brass handle of her valise to gold. She took from her pocket the little scrap of scorched paper, the remnant of the letter that had begun it all. On its blackened edge, one word remained visible. Forgive. Miss Marple stared at it for a long time. Forgive, she thought. Such a small word, and yet it weighs more than justice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her Bible, and blew out the candle. The darkness that followed was deep, but peaceful. The next morning, as her carriage rolled away from Hazelwood Grange, Miss Marple looked back once at the house, the windows gleaming faintly in the early sun, the ivy fluttering like green lace. To the world, it would be another case solved, another murder avenged. But to her, it was a parable, one more reminder that evil, like tea, is best brewed quietly and served in polite company, and, as she always thought to herself on such mornings, it is a curious thing how often death sits down with us at tea, and how seldom we notice until the cup is empty. Miss Marple's reflection: the train steamed steadily through the Sussex countryside, its rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of England itself, constant, familiar, and faintly mournful. Fields blurred past the window in shades of autumnal gold and fading green. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled the hour, soft as forgiveness. Miss Marple sat alone in her compartment, a small valise at her feet, and a tepid cup of tea cooling on the tray beside her. She gazed out at the passing hedgerows, her thoughts weaving quietly through the smoke and memory. It had been 2 days since she left Hazelwood Grange, yet the echoes of that house still lingered, the faint scent of bergamot and bitter almonds, the flicker of candlelight upon trembling faces, the hollow note of guilt that never quite fades after a confession. She thought of Lady Hesketh, sitting now perhaps in the stillness of her room, surrounded not by pearls or finery, but by silence, a silence earned, not chosen. Of Lydia, travelling north under a false name, beginning again, clutching a letter of recommendation Miss Marple had quietly arranged. Of Reverend Pottle, whose faith had curdled into judgment, and whose judgment had led him to murder. A tragedy of the spirit as much as of the flesh. Miss Marple sighed. "So many people," she murmured. "Mistake punishment for salvation." She took up her knitting, fingers moving automatically, and let her mind drift to gentler places. To St. Mary Mead, with its narrow lanes and gossip thick as cream, to the vicar's wife, who would no doubt scold her for missing tea, to her little garden, where the chrysanthemums would be waiting, faithful and unjudging. Yet even amidst such tranquil recollections, the questions persisted and meant the kind that never quite let her rest. What is guilt, truly? She thought. A stain, a weight? Or is it merely the echo of something once human, something we refuse to bury? Outside, the countryside rolled on, indifferent to such inquiries. But Miss Marple, who knew that evil rarely wore horns or scales, found no such indifference in herself. She knew too well that wickedness often came wrapped in lace gloves. Smiling sweetly over tea, it was, she reflected, the politeness of sin that made it so dangerous, the way one might poison a cup and call it courtesy. And yet, for all the darkness she had seen, she still believed in the possibility of goodness. Not the grand, public kind, but the quiet sort that lived in small mercies, a kind word, a spared judgment, a cup poured carefully for another. Her eyes softened as she watched a pair of children wave from a cottage gate. She lifted her gloved hand and waved back, smiling faintly. In that moment, she thought again of Mrs. Linton's final words. The past has a taste. Yes, it had. Sharp, bitter, and unforgettable. But so did the present, if one brewed it with compassion. The train began to slow. St. Mary Mead's modest station appeared ahead, bathed in pale sunlight. As she gathered her things, Miss Marple glanced once more at the folded scrap of paper tucked inside her Bible. The word "forgive" now almost invisible from where. She smiled quietly. "Perhaps that is as it should be," she murmured. "Forgiveness, after all, is meant to fade, to leave nothing but peace behind." The whistle blew. The train stopped. Miss Marple stepped down onto the platform, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. The porter tipped his cap. She nodded in return. Ahead lay the narrow lane to her cottage, and beyond that, the world, forever curious, forever flawed, and forever waiting for someone to notice what everyone else had overlooked. She walked on, her step unhurried, her heart steady, her mind already turning to the next whisper of mystery that might drift, like smoke, into her quiet little village. And as the candle burned low, another secret met its shadow. Candlelight Mysteries, channel, message. Thank you, dear listener, for joining us in this tale of secrets steeped in silence and truth, poured by candlelight. If you enjoyed Miss Marple and the poison in the teapot, we invite you to stay a while longer in the glow of our stories, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries and let your evenings be filled with suspense, elegance, and the timeless hush of the detective's mind at work. Because here, under the trembling flame and the soft echo of footsteps down a quiet hall, one truth always remains, another secret fades. By candlelight.